PhD is in forensics and the philosophy of psychology, public policy, and law. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a policymaker. I am a psychologist, though my specialty is, of course, cults. As many of you who know me know, I have a passion about. And my organization, the Freedom Train Project, founded the International Cults Awareness Month. Anyway, there's several different awareness days that had already existed. But everyone who knows me knows that I'm extra, and I'm like, hey, a day is great. Let's also do a month. And that's how we are here in August working on this. I guess the part that I usually mention last is that I'm a former member of the cult called NXIVM, and I was in a couple of documentaries about it. So we'll go ahead and get started while we're waiting for the people to come. So what about policy? So policy is a challenging thing, right? Because cults are not illegal, right? So there's nothing that's explicitly illegal about a cult. Also, cults are very difficult to define in general. What types of groups are cults and what types of groups are not cults? Cults are also a whole myriad of not just one single type of group that's considered a cult. It is all sorts of groups considered a cult. And as we go further into our futuristic life, what a cult does, what kind of special features are to them, absolutely evolves. So back in the beginning of our cult studies, new religious movements or sects of religious movements and cults tended to be associated with religion. And now further into the future, we found that there's actually other groups of people that operate as cults, and that's only going to get more and more sophisticated as our technology moves on. So we have to work together to find a way, a commonality of crimes, if you will, that occur to people that can be universal. And we do actually have crimes that occur to people that are universal, but we tend to, as a society, downplay those crimes because they're part of a cult and whatever misconceptions that comes with that. A lot of the people in this room understand that if a person's been like human trafficked and we find out about it, we have, oh my gosh, that's terrible. We have a human response to it. But then when we hear that they were in a cult and human trafficked in the cult, they were like, is that really trafficking though? Didn't you volunteer your time? And our thought object of that concept changes. Have you guys experienced that? Yep. We see you've experienced that. Today, our primary focus is to talk about what can we do about that. We have a mass amounts of groups with different types of ways to exploit people with different types of harm. So what can we do at a higher level of policymaking to a smaller level of personal activism in order to make change? I know there's a lot of people that post a lot of memes on social media, and that helps. We can't deny it, that helps. But is there more that you can do? So that's why we're having this thing here today. Okay. Lisa, can you please introduce yourself and your role in policy where you're at?
Hello, I'm Lisa Kendall, the director of Counter Cult Coalition. I am working on policy right now to provide the first ever government funding for children from cults.
Yes. So we're going to work Lisa's going to work on explaining to us like the steps that she's gone through. So the first question is, our first topic is, what are the key elements of effective policy designed to protect vulnerable populations, whether it's children? One of our guests is a specialist with creating policy around children. Individuals needing, another guest is a person who created policy around prosthetics, which we're waiting for him to join. And then Lisa is doing the specialist around protecting children coming from cults. And so the question is to discuss, or what are the key elements of effective policy designed to protect vulnerable populations, whether children, individuals needing prosthetics, or others. To Zoom, and our other speakers aren't here, go ahead and feel free for anyone to unmute and add your thoughts to this. Yeah, so the question that we're having out there, what are the key elements of effective policy designed to protect vulnerable populations? We know we have the evolution of our policy making and our lawmaking over time is that we had different races. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where people were like, yo, we have to make some laws in order to keep people from being horrible monsters to Black people, and then to women, and then to everything. Every time we'd make a law to protect one class of or one group of citizens, people would just go to the next group and be horrible to the next group. And so then we're like, okay, now you have to make a law to protect that group, or they would find another way to exploit that same group. So then we had the Fair Housing Acts, right? So then we had to implement fair housing and things like that, at least in the United States. Over time, this is ways that we had to implement these things so we can stop people from being horrible to other people, right? That's essentially the evolution of our policy and our lawmaking. So what types of policies and laws or what are the elements of those policies to protect these vulnerable populations? And who are the vulnerable populations? Is it just everyone who is joining a good cause or something that makes them feel good about themselves or makes them feel like they're doing something good in the world, and then turns out that they're being exploited by a cult? So what are your thoughts about that?
I think one important thing to talk about when we're on this subject is the fact that so many other countries have measures to prevent people from joining cults, to punish cult leaders and other abusers in cults, to protect children in cults. And I know the US has some outreach into high schools and colleges to prevent it, but I think we have to look at the whole thing from prevention to prosecution to therefore some kind of restitution, helping people get established after leaving a cult. And the US has some of that, but maybe not as much.
Right. Okay, does anyone want to add their thoughts to this comment?
In terms of defining vulnerable populations, I don't necessarily know, just like defining a cult can be hard, defining someone that's vulnerable. But I think based on my experiences, generally they're targeting people that have a vulnerability or something that makes them more easily persuaded to look at all of the values and positives that they're offering and maybe ignore some of the red flags. And I think that people with a trauma background, childhood trauma, and things like that may be easier targets. Not to say that a very proficient cult couldn't exploit anyone, but I think they tend to look for people with some vulnerabilities.
Yeah. One thing I would say is that we do generally have a good concept of what we consider vulnerable, I believe, in most of the developed countries, which is children, elderly, and disabled people. So we generally consider those vulnerable. We even have protective service agencies that are in place in order to protect them should someone try to be exploiting them. We have child protective services, adult protective services, which handles adults and disabled adults as well, elderly and disabled adults. And we have mandated reporters who are required to report abuse. In my line of work in the Freedom Train Project, I have to utilize those services far more than I'm really comfortable. But like I recently had to file a adult protective services for a disabled person whose parents were exploiting them and were involved in a cult. Vulnerable people. Does that make sense?
I just want to say I've never heard anybody talk about this before. And it's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that when there's an issue to go to that agency because it gives you something to hang your hat on for that person. This person is elderly, this person is disabled.
And as a victim service agency, it's a quiver that we use frequently for all victims. There's a lot of underage victims and domestic violence and sex assault and things like that. So that is a tool that I use, and I don't like it because it's very stressful for me to file these reports, but I still have to. It's one of our first lines of protecting people.
I have a question because I work in special education primarily with students with emotional disabilities, and I wonder how mental health and those types of disabilities play into the categorization of someone as a vulnerable population. And I think some of those disabilities are invisible, and so it makes it hard to define a limb.
Yeah.
But in the cases where we do know if somebody is, let's say, on Social Security for a mental issue or a intellectual disability, being able to use that, you're right, we can't always tell, but when we can, that's great because from what I understand of the rules, if you threaten to kill somebody over 62 in the US, that's taken far more seriously than if you do it to a 60-year-old. In fact, I believe it's a crime. I've actually been told that by people in the know.
All right. Okay. Would you like to say something?
Speak? Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
I think we have a bit of a problem here because I personally would regard anyone who leaves a cultic group as vulnerable. And then they might have intersections with other vulnerabilities like autistic or ADHD or trauma or whatever. Is it not the case that pretty well most leavers need help? Especially perhaps if they're born in and raised, because they have no previous life. So they leave with complete unawareness of what the real world is all about.
Yeah.
I mean, at the moment, I'm trying to work with a young man who was forced out by his parents. They called the police on him. He has ADHD and he's on the autistic spectrum and he can't get a job. And he's nearly run out of his savings. That, to me, is an extremely vulnerable adult. And thankfully, the police recognized that when he was arrested by them. But I think I was vulnerable when I left. And I didn't have any of those extra add-ons.
Yeah. Dr. Christine Marie, go ahead.
I'd like to support what Jill said.
Mhm.
I would like to add to it that I'm with Voices for Dignity. We have an organization, and Frankie here is also with my group and another person. But we consider people who are still in the group vulnerable as well. They cannot think for themselves. With their critical thinking turned off, our mindset is we do have to intervene when they don't know what's in their best interest. And it sounds condescending, but you know how it is. We do harm reduction while they're still in the group.
Where were you when I needed that?
She's been working.
Where was
for
I when I needed it?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I appreciate all of those comments. And I think that leads to the point that we want to make here, which is right now, the way we categorize vulnerabilities, currently, the way we define vulnerability is children, elderly, and disabled, right? Those are the way that our policies get prioritized. And in victim services, for instance, our victim service policies get prioritized by the severity and level of crimes that have been committed to you. If, for instance, you're a 20-year-old person who's not disabled, or you didn't experience too much in your cult, but let's say they drained you of all of your money and you have nowhere to go, they feel they've been harmed, because that's an important part of victim services, is they do have to feel they've been harmed, right? How would you categorize their vulnerability in that sense in order to create policy about it, right? Because this is about policy. It doesn't mean that they weren't harmed, and it doesn't mean that they weren't vulnerable. But how do you create the policy around it? The point of my role in this world is to help retrain people's brains in understanding what all of this means. A 20-year-old person, yeah, maybe we might not call them vulnerable, but they just experienced a situation where there was an intent to harm them by taking all their money, by changing their brain structure, by doing whatever it is that was happening in their cults, and they felt harmed. And feeling harmed could potentially be a form of PTSD, which is a neurodivergent disability. And so trying to find very creative ways in order to describe these vulnerabilities to therefore qualify them for policy support that is needed. So the comment of anybody who's coming out of a cult, or even in the cult still, so, the good points that were had, should be considered vulnerable, right? But we have to change our language structure to be able to as we're creating policy or trying to encourage policy to be created, in order to create policy that covers that type of vulnerability. Does that make sense? We have an issue in most of our policy making. I'm just checking to see if other guests have arrived. And that our issue is that there's the big religion issue. And it comes up in almost every topic. The big religion issue is, yes, but we can't make policy about religion. Freedom of religion is a thing, right? And to me, I say hogwash to that. You just have to be able to define vulnerability in your policy writing, that religions are not free to cause harm to. Does that make sense? So we don't have to worry too much about the loophole of religious freedom, because even religions still are not allowed to harm people. As we work together with your legislators or with whomever, understanding that religion loophole that they like to bring up, which happens a lot when you're working with policymakers, it's a trick. It's not really a religious loophole because religions still aren't allowed to harm their people. Anyone wants to have anything else to add to that? So the next is
I'm sorry, can I just weigh in on that?
Sure, go ahead.
Since I do meet with legislators, I want to say that I don't find that to be a problem at all. There's only one legislator who has ever felt like providing support for children leaving cults got away from parental control. And what I always say is not all cults are religious. There are cults about, there are yoga cults, or all different kinds of cults. So it isn't about religion anyway. It's only about coercion and harm. And then we just go right into policy. What can we do?
But to be fair, though, you are working with an automatic vulnerable population, which is the children, right?
No, but I know that, but even in talking about abuse of other adults, I'm just saying the world is changing. People are starting to get it. And I think a lot of the cult memoir and the documentaries are helping because people will say, oh, I watched that movie, and that has made a big difference.
Definitely.
I want to say I'm on the West Coast. I'm in a liberal city, so it doesn't apply in as much in the South, where Nikki is.
All right. I am going to move us to the next question just so that we can make sure that we're getting you guys back to work or wherever you're doing. So the question is ensuring that policies serve all affected individuals. Affected individuals are people who are leaving these coercive groups and feel harmed. And at any point, and it's not just that they feel harmed as they leave. This is a key point. They may feel harmed at any point in their future. So a person can leave a cult and feel like that group did amazing things for them. And they could go on and live their life. And 5 years later, have some awareness come to them and make them realize that I need to go get some help. It doesn't matter if they realize they've been harmed by the group, they are vulnerable. There are some people that we don't categorize as vulnerable out of these groups until they feel harmed. And there's no reason for that other than us deciding for them that they are vulnerable causes them additional harm.
I think it's context dependent because one of our living in a mindset that is filled with delusion. I think you might not say to them, you're a vulnerable, traumatized person, but at the same time, we know where their limitations are. And I'm thinking in terms of housing in the cult that I help with, they are not allowed to do certain things related, which results in housing instability. So we take that into consideration and say, okay, we're going to intervene so you can have your housing stability, because we know that is an area where what they believe is preventing them from causing harm to their family in terms of giving up their home and being homeless. So we intervene with a mindset that they can't do it, and they're grateful. That's just one example of, I think there are situations where we can do harm reduction without it causing more harm. And that's
and I agree. And I think in those scenarios, when you're like in your case, correct me if I'm wrong, you are set up in central area where the vulnerable population exists, whether or not they feel vulnerable. So if you know of someone who's leaving the group and they don't feel vulnerable, but they don't have a house to go to, then you're like, hey, we're here. We can get you into a house. But there are far more people leaving cults than people getting help for leaving cults. There are far more people leaving cults that even know that there is any help that they should get. Now, that's a bit of not a marketing issue, but that's a bit of an issue where we need to get the word out that there is help and support available. But nonetheless, there's far more people that are leaving cults. And like, for instance, 18,000 people went through the NXIVM trainings, 18,000 of them. Only about maybe 150 have been vocal about the harm that they have received. That doesn't mean that the other like thousands of people didn't experience harm, but it does mean that they haven't been vocal about it. So therefore, many of them have not received services or any type of support for them. But there are a significant amount of people who have gone through the program, they felt like it was beneficial for them, and they didn't even realize that there was a bad side to it. So they weren't really even aware that they could be harmed.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying, especially in the context of the Nexium example. And I can use that example also with the FLDS. When people leave the FLDS, many times they leave because they want to have love in their life. Right? You don't automatically have PTSD because you came out of the effort. Then when they get a barrage of other ex-members saying, no, you've been traumatized, this happened and this happened, have seen people who have left with strength take on a mindset that may or may not have been in their best interest based on the influence of others. Yeah, trying to convince people that they're victims is not a good idea.
But I was thinking about when people leave the Brethren, for example, or any group where they've been born in, they don't know that they've been harmed. They don't know that they've been through trauma. And it may take some while. In my research, the doctoral research, I think 3 of my storytellers took 30 years before they started thinking, hang on a minute. And that includes me, actually. It took me 30 years. And today on Facebook, there was a woman, at least I'm guessing she's a woman, she's posted anonymously, putting out a mega plea because she's been out for 5 years and is absolutely at rock bottom. But I think she's only just realized that she's in that state because she was raised in the Brethren and not because of any failings or shortcomings of her own. And I think a lot of people that applies to. Some leave and they know they need help. Some leave and assume everything in the garden is lovely because they don't know anything else.
And I'm going to draw that point home in just a second, but I think Ken wanted to say something.
Thanks, Tabitha. It just goes back a moment when you were talking about different advocacy groups that could get involved. And this is like a little bit outside the box thinking, but just as someone would possibly be represented by a court representative as an interpreter, as if someone could be an advocate that's court appointed speaking on behalf of this. Now, of course, this would be countered by the group, but it would also be effective if the person that was the advocate was informed and was able to point out the abuse that this person was under. Like I said, it's a little bit outside the box thinking, but I was just thinking if someone has an interpreter there because they don't understand or they're not able to be an advocate for themselves, whether underage or under duress. Thanks.
That's excellent. So we have a situation where cults change the language process of people. And so when you come out of a cult, you tend to speak that cult language, and most of the world have no clue what words you're saying or what you mean, or they just look at you, and this is my own personal experience to find, they just looked at me and they were like, you're weird. I don't know why you're saying those words. And it was very distressing for me. But a court appointed person sounds like a great policy to consider, right? That someone who is well known in the vernacular or lingo of that cult so that they can appropriately interpret. We have another guest speaker who's arrived, John Edward Heath. So I'm going to let him introduce himself in a minute. But first, I want to address the point with Jill is that one thing that we can consider for policy is to remove any statute of limitations that currently exist for this type of problem, right? So for the types of crimes that are committed towards the people in cults, and there are lots of them, like actual crimes, there's trafficking, there's labor trafficking and sex trafficking, okay? There's child abuse, there's SA rampant in most cults. Most people don't even realize they were abused in that way because the coercion was so well done and the grooming was so well done that they believe that they started it, they created it, it was everything that they wanted, and no one harmed them. And so again, that's another instance where sometimes that takes decades to undo, and you don't even realize you need to undo it until 30 years into therapy. And then you're like, wait, hold on, you get that aha moment and you're like, wait a second, that wasn't my fault. And so one policy is to remove the statute of limitations, or in the very least allow statute of limitations to be strategically extended based on the circumstances, right? So that's policy concepts overall for that one. We have our another guest speaker, John Edward Heath. Could you unmute and introduce yourself?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is John Edward Heath. I am a professional athlete, Paralympian, and adaptive CrossFit athlete. I am the lead of the So Everybody Can Move Act of Maryland. Currently, we are 6 states of legislation that we have changed. We're trying to do 28 states by 2028 Olympics for our law for disability rights. I do know that I'm here to give some guidance on legislation, law changing, and advocacy.
Mhm. Yes. So go ahead. If you would share with us abbreviated pathway that you took that we might be able to take for these ideas we've generated even in this chat today.
No, definitely. So I think your biggest power is going to find the allies that truly with whatever bill you're trying to turn into law. So having a bill sponsor is probably the priority number one, because if you have a delegate and a Senate member that doesn't with your mission, then I'm going to tell you that it's probably not going to go into effect for the law. The second thing is going to be your advocates. You have to sell, and I hate to say it that way, but you have to sell what you're trying to change to a room full of government officials, right? So for us, our key selling point was our youth. So our law is on disability and prosthetics and insurance companies. So trying to prove that a child needs prosthetics for growth, for whatever the case may be, that's the direction of where you're going to lead that into. But I think the uniqueness about what you guys are trying to do is that you have such a wide range of individuals that are affected by this, right? And that's going to play the key factor in how you build the bill and how you write it and how you're going to present it. Do we know if this is going to be a state or a federal? What are you guys aiming for?
My recommendation, and I know we haven't really discussed it, is for us to work at whatever level we feel comfortable, but start at the local level and build up.
Okay.
Because if we can get a certain number of state laws, then they'll take it more seriously at the federal level.
100%. Does somebody have a hand raised?
Lisa, you have a hand raised.
On that front, I just want to say that in looking at contacting a legislator and contacting them for anything, just sending a letter, a phone call, anything about the issue of the need for policy to support people from cults in any way is helpful, just gets it on their plate. But what I have found is that first you start with your own representative. This is in the US anyway. So if you're a constituent of a certain person, you go to their website, you look down for anything that could apply, housing, justice, things like that. What I do is make a phone call and then I'll follow it up with an email. I then sometimes send thank you cards. And so for the 3 legislators who are going to be working on the bill that I've proposed, 2 of them are on the Justice Committee, so they already are involved in crafting the legislation. So I thought that I was going to have to write it. That was the plan. That's what the Oregon Children's Institute told me I'd have to do, and they took it up. I think it's really important to start from that. And then in meeting with them, the important things are that they will say are important is being able to tell them that there are templates, that in other countries they're doing this, in other states they're doing that. You always have to tell them they don't want to be the first one doing it, that other people have done that. Then telling them about interventions in your city or state. That's something that the policy director, Dana, of the Oregon Children's Institute has impressed on me, that it's really important to be able to tell them where people have intervened locally. So whenever I'm reading the newspaper, things like that will jump out at me. I make a note of it and then contact that person. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. Yes, so Lisa is working on specific policy for protecting children that are coming out of cults in Oregon.
Adults.
And young
As
adults.
long as you were a child in a cult, if you were an SGA, if you come to us at the age of 20, you will get material support through the age of 24.
Yeah.
And that's what's important is this topic doesn't just apply to a certain demographic, right? Like it's a range. So it's about putting it into perspective to whatever legislation person is really going to take it to heart. The best advice I will give you is you have probably like a 5 to 8 minute window when you meet with a delegate or a Senate governor, whatever the case may be, because like their meetings are back to back.
Yeah.
So having that pitch that you're going to tell them for that 5 to 8 minute is gonna be very important, because you know we're not the only ones trying to change laws and bills and stuff. So that's going to play a massive role into it. But
That's
yeah,
really, the meetings here in Portland tend to be 10 minutes long, whether in person or online. And then they always give me extra time. But yeah, you're allotted 10 minutes.
yeah. So that plays a role. And then you got to figure out which state, right? So like Maryland is 90 days to be in session, which is not a lot of time to change a bill and convince everyone that's voting into doing it. So each process is different. We just changed it in New Mexico, and that process was not anywhere guided the way that we did it.
Don't you have alternating short and long sessions?
I'm sorry.
Here we have alternating long and short sessions. So this year was a short session, so we can't put the bill in till next year when it's a long session. So we've already got the meetings planned for next year.
90 days here, because I was like, if you don't get everything done in 90 days, you got to wait to the next session.
Yes, Jill, would you share your thoughts?
That's what I was going to say. Am I the only Brit amongst this group? Because of course, everything works completely differently in the UK. I can't, for example, go and put in a bill or do any of those amazing things that you guys are talking about. Nor is the support for children up to the age of 24 who have left a cult. There is nothing. We don't have anything at all. We have domestic abuse centres, we have trauma centres, but we have nothing for people who leave cultic groups. This just doesn't exist here. If they do, then they're charities. So there's one charity I can think of that Rod and Linda Dubrow Marshall run, but they're two people. So what can they do with the thousands that leave cultic groups in the UK every year?
They're training a bunch of people to work with them.
Their MSc does not train people to work with leavers. It just provides them with the knowledge. If they want to work with leavers, they need to go and get some further training, therapy or advocacy or whatever it is.
Thank you for clarifying.
Important, yes.
Yeah. We had a question. What is the difference between policy and legislation?
So for us, what it was is you're proposing a bill, right? And it just depends on the parameters of what they're going. So we went for prosthetics and orthotics. And in that, they pulled prosthetics and turned the bill of prosthetics into law and turned the orthotics into a policy that will be revisited next year, because Maryland is in a deficit for financial budget. So anything that was coming out of state money wasn't going to pretty much get passed, just because we're in a deficit of financial. So it really depends on what we changed was by law. So like now we're working in DC to get this turned into a federal law. So we're not working state by state, but like Lisa had said, or whoever said it, like you're trying to do little states here and there. So when you come to present it at a higher level, it's you have like, because now we have 6 states. So now that we're taking it to the federal level, it's, hey, we've successfully done this in this amount of states. Who can we find to sponsor it at a higher level? Lisa's got her hand up again.
I'm going to add Lisa real fast. So one key difference is that the law is what's written, and the very basic understanding of the policies are basically the hows and wherefore tos of how to implement or enforce that law. And so those can change based on the needs, but the law itself, once it's a law, can't change as easily. It requires lots of people and voting and things like that to change.
That for legislation or law, you're talking about public policy encompasses more, because policy would encompass nonprofit. For instance, in Multnomah County, there was an agency who had a policy to go into homes where there were a certain amount of unrelated children. And it was a way to get at cults without ever using the word cult. That's policy, that's not law. And as Tabitha said, that could change. Also, policy being what all sorts of organizations, schools, laws do, how they might decide to intervene in a situation outside of the law.
Thank you for everyone. Does anyone want to add any more to this particular topic? And John, You were fabulous. That helped explain the process quite a bit. I did throw in 2 links of content that is on International Cult Awareness Month. One of them is just general steps. They're meant to be generic so that you can look up the way it works in your locality. And then the second one is an actual practice of contacting your local people. It's important, but asking your local people to declare August International Cult Awareness Month. You can do anything you want, but this is something that does need to happen so that we can get this to be actually recognized across the globe, but wherever you are. And now this is a letter again that works for the United States. I don't know how other countries work, and our international part of ICAM is eventually going to take off, but it's a grassroots movement. I'm glad to see one representative from another country in this chat. Hopefully in the future we'll see more. But the final thing I want to close us on, and we have 5 minutes, is just share with us. And I want to start with our presenters that are here, Lisa and John, and then everyone else can join in. But what are some policies and or laws that you would like to see that supports victims of coercive control and cult abuse? Just start with Lisa and John, and then the rest can join in. This is recorded, and we'll get them listed and prioritized and see what we can do over the next year.
I would like to see more education for police officers and other first responders so that when they go into a situation, they recognize a problem. A lot of people have that reaction of going, we can't do anything about it. And instead helping people be more proactive and saying, what can we do about it? And being able to recognize the signs of potential cultic involvement, for instance, with foster parents, training for foster parents and their case managers.
Thank you.
I would have to agree. I'm a foster kid myself, so I think there's not a lot of education on from the ground up, but I also think just the primary thing will be to educate. So what I learned is it's not that people don't care about what I'm changing, it's just they're not educated. So there needs to be more integration and training in whatever realm you're in. So I think that would be like the first priority to start.
Okay. Who else wants to throw out some? You can write it also here in the chat as well. Oh, wait, we have 2 people from the UK, Miranda and Jill. Thank you for coming.
Can I speak?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, it was something Lisa said about educating the police that made me remember something. I've been contacted by somebody in New Zealand who is writing kind of education / policy documents, educational type documents, which she's asked me to have a look through to see if I think anything needs to be added or taken away, etc. And they're actually very good. If you have someone coming into to see you and you're a doctor, think about this, that, and the other. And do you know what I mean? Make sure you know about the cult, etc. There's a whole bunch of advice that she's giving. And her goal is to actually spread it, to make it more global. They're very good documents. There are 3 of them. One is for current members. So if you get a current member sitting in front of you, another is obviously for leavers. It's about the kind of harm that high control groups can create. And I think that's probably the one that I shall have more input in rather than the others. But they are looking actually very good and very helpful. So that's a bit of good news coming from New Zealand.
So speaking of the training needed for foster parents, the training is also needed for the case managers and all the professionals involved. And I'll give you a few examples that are relevant right now in my world, with certain children being taken from a harmful situation, and they're all young sister wives. Then the group, the CPS, put them all together in a group home. So then you have the stronger girls influencing the younger girls. And so they have the group dynamic, which is identical to the cult. Someone would come clean. Everybody was afraid to speak to attorneys. And I told them, this is not a good idea. They all need time away from each other. They did what they wanted. Then when they finally separated them, then they still put them in sibling pairs, because that's what it makes sense. But again, you have an older, more devout sibling still having an influence on you for a while. And then another mistake that I believe was made is when they did put all the children separate, they put the siblings back together, which was great. But then they put them in foster that were, in 2 cases, strongly religious households. And in both cases, they went from this cult to now sibling sets are baptized members of other religions. And that drives me crazy too, because they're still underage. They still don't have their sea legs yet in the real world. And now they're being subjected to the influence of this family that they're in.
Yes. I've been writing an article on the Children of God for Springer Encyclopedia. And I've been studying the Argentina case, which many of you probably don't know about, but the Argentina case was a complete disaster. It was early in the 1990s. I believe it was the 90s. And it was like the sort of first attempt at saving the children from the children of God. And it was a whole disaster. There was a lot of situations that occurred that put the children in awful positions of having to have the old style virginity checks that just are awful today. There was opposing opinions and beliefs about the hymen is intact or it's not intact, and it went back and forth based on the side that was interviewing them. The children were all traumatized from it. And of course, in that case, because they're being traumatized by a third-party system, they bonded even closer to their abusive parents at home, and that was like fodder for the abusive parents to say, my children are more closer to me now, so they love me, and you guys are all awful people. So the whole thing collapsed in, and it's a very interesting topic. I think also policy around the way we investigate and the way we care for this vulnerable population is important. They've gotten rid of that way of determining if someone has been harmed in that way, but nonetheless, less developed countries still utilize those types of checks, if you will, but policy around really caring for these individuals and not just doing whatever the heck you want to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to compile a list of all of these policies, and we're going to put it on our website. And then I would love to continue the dialogue. This whole month is about policies, laws, and cults, to try to inspire people, because we would love to see more people go and talk to their delegates, just like Lisa and like John, Edward. And we would love for people to be able to go and do that. But if you can't, if you don't have the ability, then we're going to give lots of opportunities over the rest of the month to do letter writing campaigns. The first one being, please make this International Cult Awareness Month for your city, but also other things like, please provide whatever your specialty is, whatever is important to you. You can actually write a letter to your delegates asking for that. And you'd be surprised. Some small cities and stuff would be like, sure, no problem. This doesn't cost us a thing. So it tends to be, a lot of them in the smaller municipalities tend to be like granted, because why not?
Anyway, I just wanted to add to that when I met with the last legislator here in Oregon, he was so angry about cults before I got there that he did most of the talking.
That's
It was
awesome.
just, Lisa, give me a pen, I'll sign anything.
And we also have some lawmakers, even in the UK, actually, of people who are former victims of cults. And so those people you might be able to like tag into and be like, hey, we know this is important to you. Can you like work with us? They might be helpful in that case. All right. I'm available via text. I'm a terrible communicator, but I do my best. And you guys have all been lovely. So thank you so much for coming. All right.
It's lovely to see everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.